as an independently produced Bite Back special presents the BBC's annual report to licence payers. See for yourself.
Good evening and welcome to See for Yourself. This year, the BBC's equivalent of an annual general meeting has been converted into a special edition of Bite Back with a larger studio audience than usual. The Director General of the BBC, Sir Michael Checkland, has come to take his place in the Bite Back hot seat. He'll be facing questions from viewers and listeners with complaints or queries about BBC radio and television. We also have a number of experts dotted around the studio with particular knowledge of the key areas we'll be discussing. We'll be looking less tonight at the achievements and successes of the corporation, more at the problems and challenges it faces as the renewal of its charter, its permit to broadcast, draws closer. Obviously, we can't cover everything in an hour. So first, Bite Back reporters Richard Jobson and Carol Stone review some of the issues and events that have put the BBC in the news during the past 12 months.
The Gulf War dominated BBC news coverage during the early months of the year. It brought 1 million extra listeners to a special rolling news on Radio 4 FM and awards for reporters who stayed on in Baghdad.
Former ICI boss Sir John Harvey-Jones, who dispensed business advice in the BBC's own Troubleshooter series, turned his artillery on the corporation itself. He suggested cutting management by a third.
The corporation set up 15 task forces to examine every aspect of its operations. Their findings are already making waves.
February saw the unveiling of the new idents for BBC One and BBC Two. The latter won design awards.
But what did the viewers think of them? Then came the launch of World Service television broadcast to Europe. An Asian service started up near the end of the year.
How's it seeing you at the doctor's? Well, yes. Is it the old trouble?
Red Nose Day 3 raised more than £7 million and was just one of the charity fundraising events held by the BBC.
Woman's trouble.
In May, Junior Education Minister Michael Fallon called BBC's children's programmes fast food television and said they were too commercialised.
Jane Drabble became the BBC's highest promoted woman in the television service when she was appointed Assistant Managing Director.
And in June, John Burt, the Deputy Director General, was appointed to succeed Sir Michael Checkland in March 1993.
As international events hotted up, the BBC in general and the World Service in particular showed they could reach the parts
other broadcasters just can't reach.
How did the Soviet president keep in touch when isolated by a coup?
BBC лучше всего.
And who breached the cell walls of a Beirut hostage? It wasn't only Terry Waite who was full of praise.
I'm afraid I have to admit that the BBC has everybody beaten, hands down.
In September, on Going Live, the hamburger generation bit back.
But a third of the programmes are actually factual that we put out. A third of our programmes are factual. I mean, that's 88, as we were saying, but you mentioned Newsround. Heartbeat is another programme, 88 dramas a year. It's not all soap.
No, I accept that.
It was a rocky year for the BBC's main rival, ITV, as familiar faces TVAM, Thames, TVS and TSW lost their franchises.
In November, the annual Children in Need appeal raised £17 million. It looked like the Beeb could have done with the money themselves. They announced major cuts in their television resources.
On BBC One, audience figures were said to be falling like autumn leaves. One remedy was the replacement of Artel with Ardell Soul.
Outside.
Instead of Chat, there'll be a weekly drama series set among expats in Spain. And one of Britain's top-paid television presenters makes way for a £10 million soap. What's that in pesetas?
Well, I make it 1,750 million pesetas, if you really want to know. Overall, BBC One has been losing its traditional share of the audience during the past year. And although ratings aren't the only things that matter, they are an important part of the argument for retaining the licence fee. Why should we pay for programmes we're not watching? Of course, not all programmes are expected to get high audiences. As a public service broadcaster, the BBC has to cater for a wide range of tastes and interests. But two areas that are expected to do well are situation comedy and popular drama. This year, there have been some notable successes, with 8 programmes in the top 10 comedies. But we've also heard complaints, particularly about the number of repeats. Richard Jobson reports.
Right, stand by everywhere, please. OK, ready there?
Oh, it's not right. You're one of us. I'll speak to Mr. Goat.
A recording a few weeks ago of the 1920s spoof You Rang My Lord. Since it was the last in the series, the studio crew wore evening dress. With 3 series completed and an audience of 9 million, they're just at the point where they could hope to become an established comedy classic, though they'd have to increase their ratings to be a huge audience grabber like Only Fools and Horses.
Well, she wouldn't be any trouble. She'd have said she'd eat behind the bushes.
Yes, and she'd drink everything she could.
Developing a hit takes time, and with limited resources, the money for new series has to be eked out by repeats, especially in the summer. The first series of You Rang My Lord was not the only one to be repeated last year. There was also Allo Allo, Birds of a Feather, Bread, Brushstrokes, Butterflies, Dad's Army, Dear John, Reggie Perrin, From May to December, Joint Account, Keeping Up Appearances, On the Up, One Foot in the Grave, Only Fools and Horses, Open All Hours, Up Pompeii, and Waiting for God.
What's on the telly tonight?
Nothing much in anything, darling. I think it's a repeat of that series they repeated last year.
The pattern shown by comedy fits into a larger picture. On BBC One, repeats made up 28% of all programmes. On BBC Two, it was 49%, including schools and Open University programmes. These figures are much higher than for ITV and Channel 4.
What do you mean you haven't noticed it? Listen, I said...
There's absolutely no doubt that repeats are a service that people do enjoy watching, and particularly the comedy repeats. And comedy repeats also perform another function, which is to build public interest and build the new comedy shows as they come along. Nevertheless, it also has to be said, I think, that we are trying to bring down the number of repeats. I don't think we should ever move away from using our schedule to repeat our popular shows. But one of the reasons that the Director General has put more money into BBC One is in order not to make it so reliant on repeats, particularly during the spring and summer.
But we've had some laughs, haven't we? We've had some laughs along the way, over the years, haven't we?
As far as comedy output is concerned, some of the repeats have drawn much bigger audiences than a few of the new comedy series launched this year.
That's a ticket!
All right, 2 of them fell by the wayside, but I think 2 out of 7 isn't too bad. I mean, I'm not being complacent. I'm never complacent. I've never done anything that I felt satisfied with in my life, and I'm not going to start now. There's always room for improvement in anything in life. I'm not saying that we have answered all the questions. I would love to find a lot more new writers, and if anybody who is watching this programme wishes to submit us scripts, we are more than happy to read them. That's what we're here for, and give them every consideration and what help we can.
Of course, it's awfully hard to make hit shows. Don't let's be too scathing about this. Everybody knows that a winning formula is not something that you can just write an equation for and then, hey presto, it turns up.
In drama, while established series like Casualty went from strength to strength, peaking at over 15 million viewers, some of the new series did not live up to expectations.
Clearly we've had a disaster with Trainer this past autumn, which is a very odd example really of spending £5 million and not being I suppose, terribly careful about the content. It was badly scripted. The stars in it, the terrific stars, Susanna York and David McCallum and Nigel Davenport, they just haven't been used properly. I mean, nobody even thought to give the horses a bit of character. Nobody seems to have read Black Beauty and thought, well, let's have horses which maybe, eat peppermints or open stable doors or something. And there's been no romance, no sex. So I don't quite know. It seems to me a lack of attention to the detail, if you like, of popular drama, and to have lost the touch, really, for things.
We're not in the business of simply axing things after the first series because they don't do very well. Were we in that business, Casualty, one of television's biggest hits, would not be on the screen. Its audiences for its first series were roughly in the area that Trainer has started off with.
Last April, BBC One's audience share fell to 33%, compared to 43% for ITV, a 10% gap which had not improved by the autumn.
I'm sinking, Mr. Matherin.
Don't touch in the bug. He's in the bug. Don't panic. Be quiet.
The press began to notice something had to be done.
I know that. I'm not a complete nincompoop. Or am I?
Well, the BBC really has run out of money for its main popular BBC One channel. What's happened really is that they have, I think, spread themselves too thinly, and they have not been putting in the same amounts of money for programmes, certainly on BBC One, as ITV does. I mean, they're probably outpointed by about a third in terms of budgets, so ITV has more to spend.
The ratings over the past year have gone down, that is absolutely true. And we recognise that. That is why we are putting another £40 million into popular entertainment on BBC One. You have to look at this within, I think, two contexts. Firstly, ITV has been very strong. They put a lot of money and a lot of effort into getting their franchises back. There is no guarantee that that will go on. And they focused very strongly on drama. And secondly, you also have to recognise that BBC One is about other things than simply ratings. It is about remaining committed to a public service broadcasting schedule where a whole variety of programmes and subject matters and different ways of seeing and looking at things are included in a popular schedule.
That extra £40 million for television, is that in fact an admission that BBC viewers, television viewers, have not been getting what they deserve?
Well, when I became Director General in 1987, I thought the first priority was to strengthen news and current affairs. And we put a substantial amount of money to get this core part of public service broadcasting right. So we invested in overseas offices, we invested in specialist correspondence, we brought radio and television together. We knew we had to also correct the amount of money going into the popular base of BBC programming, which I believe is fundamental to the success of the BBC as a public service broadcaster for the future. And what we did was to find ways from economies and savings throughout the BBC to put money now into comedy and into drama and to maintain the sporting contracts which people expect from us.
But was it a response to falling ratings?
No, it wasn't. No, the first, we discussed it at a joint conference of the boards about 18 months ago, and the first money we'd put into popular programming was in February of this year, once we'd known the outcome of the licence fee review.
Well, I'd like to go straight to our audience, and perhaps Nick Grant would like to open the bowling.
My question, Mr. Checkland, is this. We've lived through 12 years of a government which has basically said private good, public bad, whereas I think public is good. And I think that the public service commitment of the BBC should be maintained. I think overall for the future, the BBC should be setting the standards for all other broadcasting services. Do you see that as your own particular goal, or do you think that the BBC should pay attention to the ratings?
I think the BBC has to be at the centre of British broadcasting. Our reputation is unrivalled around the world, as you've heard from some distinguished people commenting about the BBC's role on the World Service in some of those extracts. We are in public service broadcasting. The BBC's job is to be distinctive in quality and in provision. It must not lower its standards. And when we're involved with comedy, we've got to not only to do comedy that makes people laugh, we've also got to do comedy that makes people think. And interesting, looking at the various comedies that are shown over the years, we remember the great classics, the Porridges and the Dad's Armies and all the rest of them. In most years, there were only 2 or 3 in any year, if one historically looks. And there were many, many comedies which none of us can remember. which have fallen by the wayside. So it's not any different really to look at this year and to say there are some comedies which have done very well, like Only Fools and Horses or Birds of a Feather. Some of the other programmes haven't done very well, and we will go on commissioning. But our standards are crucial to the future of the BBC.
But surely the question is, can the BBC afford to chase ratings and also provide its public service commitment?
It can absolutely afford to chase quality. That is what we are about. Over the last 5 years, we've had a whole process of putting money into programmes. As I say, we started with news and current affairs. We're now putting money into popular programming. That money has been achieved by reducing the infrastructure of the BBC, by reducing resources, closing down studios, which you've seen with Lime Grove and the television theatre.
Yes, but in television, a quarter of all your money is still going into administration.
Not true. I think
that's according to your own figures.
No, I don't think you'll find that in any figures that you'll see published.
Damien Green.
So, Michael, you say that, or rather, you refuse to say that you're going to chase ratings. Is it not part of the obligation of the BBC to remain a mass broadcaster? We've already heard that ratings have gone down over this year. It seems inevitable over the decade to come, as more television channels come on screen, the BBC's audience share will decline further. Is there ever a point at which you would feel uncomfortable with receiving a licence fee extracted from every household in this country if you're not actually providing a service that goes every week quite regularly for quite a lot of hours into every household in this country?
I think the future does mean that as new channels come into being, satellite is now in 2 million homes for satellite and cable, that it is going to affect the audiences not only for the BBC but also for ITV and Channel 4. That is inevitable. It's happened in America. The American networks now only have 60% of the audience. And the American networks ignored cable. They thought it wasn't going to work. We are not ignoring the new competition from satellite or from cable. We know it's going to be a fact of our life. But we have firmly to say that we are in the business of quality and distinctive provision. Now, that doesn't mean that we can't have popular programming. We are in major sport, we are in major comedy, we are in major popular drama. And we will have to keep that popular base strong. Otherwise, the future of the BBC will be what has happened to public service broadcasting in Canada or in Australia or in America, where the audience share is something like 15 or 12 or 7% for public service broadcasting in America. What is important is that the reach of our programmes is high. That is the real test. Now, by reach, I mean that at the moment, 90% of people in this country view our programmes week in, week out. That some point during the week. Now,
Damien
that
Green,
is
are you
crucial.
satisfied with that answer?
If you're right, if the reach stays up, then it seems to me justifiable. But it does seem to me that now, while the BBC is very strong, has huge public affection, has this huge audience, now is the time to start planning to say if we ever do get to a stage where our reach maybe is below 50%, then at that stage, how are we going to fund the BBC? Is the BBC doing enough now to generate the income that would replace some of the licence fee money?
What's the minimum figure? Yes. I mean, how far would audience need to drop, do you think, before you'd forfeit the right to a licence fee?
I don't think, if the reach remains high, then we wouldn't forfeit the right. If we've got a situation where less than half the population are actually viewing or listening to our programmes any week, one would have to query a licence fee-based funding. I do not believe that is the case. We produce such a range of programmes, both popular and minority, appealing to people's interests, not only at network level but also local and regional level, that I believe we will be able to maintain that reach. If we do, the argument for general funding, I think, remains.
How can Sir Michael justify the closure of the BBC's script unit, which actually develops new writers, at a time when you're clearly crying out for new writing for television, in comedy and, even more important, I think, drama, when this makes it much more likely that you'll be relying on a shrinking pool of writers who are already established?
Good question. Why was the script unit done away with?
Because we found that our new writing was not coming through the script unit. It was actually coming through the producers and from the department with their access to writers in the community. And we found that we were not getting the benefit from this investment. Now, we've got discussions with the Writers Guild how we can encourage new writers. We have comedy workshops being developed also. So we have to broadcaster, put our money into talent. And broadcasting emerges, first of all, from writing. And we are not going to let down the writers in this country. The script unit was not the most appropriate way to deal with it in the 90s.
But how is it that something like Drop the Dead Donkey was actually offered to the BBC and turned down? Other programmes that started life on Radio 4 were actually picked up by the commercial station. This doesn't mean to say, it suggests to me that you don't have your eye on the ball.
Well, I think there's no doubt at all that we missed out on some of the radio ideas. No question about that. And I wouldn't stay and defend that. What we have made sure is that we have moved people from radio into light entertainment. The previous head of light entertainment radio now works in television. Now we are actually making sure that we have proper movement of ideas between radio and television, and that will shoot benefits. No doubt we made mistakes. I wouldn't.
A bit later in the day, yes, sir.
Well, I wonder what the BBC is going to do in the coming year to ensure that it once again produces national dramas in the way that it did with Play for Today, or even something like the Forsyte Saga, and in the way that the independent channels have done this year with Darling Buds of May, Inspector Morse, and GBH. And GBH I have to focus on particularly because that seems to me exactly the kind of thing the BBC should have done and could have done, and probably might have done it better had it got hold of it. I wonder what the BBC is going to do about that.
I would have thought The Children of the North was actually a very contemporary film and a difficult film to make about life in Northern Ireland. The BBC is not moving out of national drama. We are determined to spend more money on drama, as we've said earlier. One of the major points that Maggie Brown made in her comments in that film is that there is an imbalance between the amount of money that we are spending on drama and the amount of money that ITV are spending. In the first 6 months of this year, ITV were outspending us in a ratio of about 3 to 1. ITV spend £800 million roughly on producing the ITV network. The BBC spends about £500 million. Now that's on BBC One. Now BBC Two, we actually spend rather more than Channel 4, and I think that's reflected very much in the schedules of BBC Two. But we're not moving out of drama. We are going to put in more money to commission more drama.
Yes, anyone else?
I want to bring you back to your point about minority programming, and to ask you why you feel that black members of the society should pay their BBC license fees at all, because I don't feel, especially in the comedy roundup they showed on the television, that there certainly wasn't any black representation. And as a black member of the society and as a license fee payer, I just feel it's a rip-off to keep charging black people.
You may have heard that we've actually started a workshop for black writers, deliberately to encourage it. We are producing 6 new comedy series in the new year, and one of those will actually be covering will be written by a black writer and will include black actors. And I would hope that in the whole fabric of programmes that we're making, that you would feel you're getting value for 21p a day.
If you now have the practice of producers finding new writers, surely that's perpetuating this old boy network that BBC is famous for.
Well, I hope not. I would have thought that if one takes comedy, we concentrate on comedy. We are producing, this year, we're commissioning about 180 units of half-hour comedy. 3 years ago, we were commissioning about 130 units. Now, we are actually encouraging people to give us ideas. We're encouraging the top writers, and we want new ideas. We want them to be sent to us, so do send them. When Robin Nash asked for them, he meant it.
I would like to ask Mr. Checkland, how does he account for the loss of cricket coverage?
Well, can I talk?
You have lost the World Series in Australia to Sky B. You have given up the Sunday afternoon league. You have given up the county championship apart from the semis and the finals, and I fear that next year the NatWest will go the same way. Why can't we have the cricket?
It's quite a difficult job being Director General. We lost the cricket to Sky because Sky outbid us, and it was straightforward.
Why didn't you outbid them?
Because we did not know it was a closed bid.
Well, you could have.
And we were told that there was no way we could go back to the negotiation. It was over Sky. I would like to show the highlights of Sky, and if Sky are listening tonight, and they'd like to allow us to show the highlights of that cricket for BBC viewers, I will willingly pay for it. We have got back from Sky.
My £77. The only thing I watch is cricket in National Hunt
We've
Racing.
just got back, if I can say so, the NatWest from Sky, and we shall be showing the NatWest and the Benson and Hedges on the BBC this year. We've got a 3-year contract we've just negotiated with the TCCB.
Yes, I know you have.
The BBC intends to be the premier cricket channel, and there will be occasions, and it will happen in other sports, when we will be outbid.
Why did you give away the Rugby World
Again,
Cup?
same. We went into a bidding situation, we made presentations to the unions, and again, we lost in that contractual negotiation. We then went into the 5 championships negotiations, and we won that negotiation. And that is what will happen in sport.
We must move on because I want to move on to radio. Now, at least in its ratings battle with ITV, the BBC has had 20 years of experience to draw on. But in radio, with the launch of the first national commercial stations, the corporation will be facing a totally unfamiliar challenge. Richard Jobson woke up to the changes.
This is BBC Radio 4. It's 6:30, time for Today.
Good morning from Sue McGregor and Chris Lowe. It's Monday the 25th of November.
20 years ago, the BBC ruled the airwaves. There was the Light programme, the Home Service, and the third programme. No competition in sight. But things have changed since then.
LBC News Talk 97.3.
95.8 Capital FM. London 100 Kiss FM.
There are now 112 local commercial radio services around the country, and these are soon to be joined by 3 new national commercial radio stations. So how has the BBC reacted to this competition?
In the beginning, the Word already was. The Word was in God's presence, and what God was, the Word was.
The Word has been the mainstay of Radio 4 for over 40 years, and during that period nothing much has really changed. But then controller Michael Green thought it was time for some radical rescheduling. Morning Story was moved to the mid-afternoon. Forward came the afternoon play from 3 to 2 p.m. At 10, the station splits into 2 frequencies, with entertainment on FM and the Bible on longwave. And, following the Bible, in the biggest shake-up of all, comes another sacred object.
And now it's time for Woman's Hour with Jenny Murray.
Good morning. Price wars and trading on a Sunday. Cutthroat competition at the supermarket.
Plans to move Women's Hour provoked one of the biggest rows of the year, prompting thousands of complaints and strong opposition from the programme's production team. The BBC replied that changes were necessary to boost Radio 4's audience and were only made after extensive research. Has it worked? Well, there's no doubt that the change has been good for ratings, attracting up to 250,000 more listeners to Women's Hour.
It was a bit of a shock to think, my goodness, this programme I've lived with all my life is actually going to move to the morning. We are encouraged, though, by the fact that we've put on 250,000 new listeners in the morning. That's a bigger audience listening to what I consider to be a very important programme. There's also an evening repeat starting at the beginning of this year. So we hope that those people who can't listen to us in the morning will be able to get us in the early evening.
It's not just Radio 4 which has been moved around. From tomorrow, Radio 2 listeners will wake up to a new schedule. And one of the men who's been moved is at work behind this door. Let's find out how he feels about the changes.
Morning, Jameson here, back in the bunker after a week on the telly. My goodness, radio's best, you know.
Derek Jameson, Radio 2's morning presenter for 6 years, will be hosting a new late night show with his wife Ella.
You've got to think of the Beavers like the old music hall. You are employed to do a turn. And they employed me to do the morning shift for all those years. And now someone up there on high has decided, let's change the acts, let's turn the bill round, and they've got me doing the late night one, the 10:30 at night. And it's my job as an artiste. I'm an artiste, I have to make it work.
Schedule changes are one way of responding to the competition, but are they enough? Nationally, the BBC's audience share has fallen over the last 3 years from 65% to 59%. Over the same period, commercial radio share has increased from 31% to 36%. But it's in London that the threat is most clear-cut. Last year, for the first time, more Londoners listened to commercial radio than to all the BBC stations put together. In the light of all of this, some critics of the BBC say it's time for a rethink, time to redefine the whole meaning of the BBC's public service remit. I'm on my way to meet a man well placed to comment on the fast-changing radio scene. He's been the presenter of Radio 4's feedback programme for the past 6 years, Chris Dunkley.
they've obviously got the difficulty that where they do face competition over popular music, they have tended to be losing. If you look at the London situation, which is the most dramatic, I suppose, they have lost quite heavily over recent years to popular, middle-of-the-road music stations. So they've got to decide what they're going to do with Radio 1 and Radio 2. In speech radio on Radio 4, they've got to decide whether or not they want to run a rolling news service. There's been a lot of talk about it over the last few years with things like the Gulf War or Tiananmen Square. And they have to decide whether to put lots of resources into that and run a permanent news service. They have to decide whether they've got Radio 5 right. A lot of people would say they've got it wrong because it's had such low figures and a lot of people are not clear about what it's trying to do. Radio 3 has always had a tiny audience. Can they sustain a station which costs so much per capita when they're being pushed into a more and more competitive situation? They face a huge dilemma across the entire front.
A huge dilemma. Do you know the answer to any of those questions?
I think what we've got to do is decide on the programme areas that we need to cover in the future. There's no doubt the BBC has always had a network monopoly in this country, and that's going to be changed very dramatically. And we've got to see what the competition's going to be like. We know that Classic FM is going to be the first network, and that comes on stream this year. We don't know what the second and third networks are going to be. But even at local level, there are now 105 commercial stations with split wavelengths in some cases competing against the BBC. So this is new territory for the BBC to be challenged in this way in radio.
Well, let's talk about local radio in a minute, but first of all I'd like to talk about Radios 1 and 2. Mike Phillips?
I wonder if Sir Michael could tell us what the future holds for Radio 1 and 2. Given the BBC's finite resources and the fact that the network of independent local radio stations throughout the UK provides a sort of programming that's virtually indistinguishable from that offered by Radios 1 and 2. Why does the BBC feel it needs to compete with the independent radio network?
Well, I hope you don't find it indistinguishable, because if you actually take Radio 1, we don't just play records, we encourage new bands. We allow young groups who haven't got any recording contracts to come into our studios. I think we have about 5,000 studio hours a year devoted to new groups who have this opportunity to broadcast. That must be good for popular music making in this country. The most listened to radio bulletin on the BBC is not on Radio 4, it's on Radio 1 at 12:30 every lunchtime. Radio 1 includes community programmes where we talk to younger people about problems of drug abuse, alcohol, about job opportunities, career guidance, where we get millions of pamphlets which we get involved with and thousands of phone calls that we deal with youngsters. That isn't mirrored anywhere in the kind of Radio 1.
It may not be mirrored to the same degree at the moment, certainly not on a national basis, but before long we will have at least 3 independent national radio stations, one of which is more than likely to play popular music and will very likely take on the sort of public service aspects that you've mentioned. And they are a very limited amount of Radio 1's output. They're very good and should be commended, but they do nevertheless form a very small proportion of the output of Radio 1, which is basically wall-to-wall music. And the point you mentioned about the new bands, I believe is also adequately covered by independent local radio and will surely be done by national radio as well.
I think that's I'd be very surprised if commercial stations who have got to be considering their advertising income and their audience levels are going to be prepared to commission and encourage new bands to deal with news, to deal with community issues in the way that the BBC has.
One of the things that you say you're going to do, or possibly going to do, is to start a rolling news service. Now, Janice Foster-Jones, you have a particular interest in this, don't you?
Yes, my husband was one of the Human Shield hostages in Iraq, and whilst he was away, I was desperate for up-to-date news. So I was delighted that you introduced the rolling news service during the Gulf War.
Would you like to be permanent?
Yes, I would. I'm rather disappointed that you haven't continued it, because I think it was very popular. There have been a lot of important news stories this year. And we are now in 1992. I feel there's scope for a lot more detailed news from Europe.
Well, Sir Michael, we've got a general election coming along. Can you promise us a rolling news service by then?
No, I don't think we're planning to do that. There are a number of issues involved. We know when there is a major news story like the Gulf, clearly there is a great appetite for it. And indeed, when the Gorbachev coup in August and when Terry Waits returned, we always now split Radio 4 and put a news service, an extended news service, on long wave, because long wave will be the future of such a service. What we're considering is whether we can sustain such a service through normal events. Now, there are a number of views on that. We don't want it to be more speculation and not enough news. That irritates people enormously. I went to a public meeting in Henfield, and we asked how many people in the audience, if 350 wanted a rolling news, and 3 people put up their hand. So it's something we have to consider very carefully. There's no doubt that I believe that by the mid-90s we shall have such a service. But it does involve extra money. I think the costs, when I last looked at them, were about £12 million of extra money to run this service for 24 hours a day. We've got to find that money from somewhere. We've got to get the right kind of service. I believe it will be part of the whole fabric of public service provision in radio by the mid-90s. It's not going to come in 1992.
Yes, sir.
What worries me about the development of continuous news is that there's no attempt to use the extra time to give a balanced and coherent news programme. You'll double the length of a news bulletin and the entire rotten bulletin will be devoted to one topic. When, in the first week of the Gulf War, the government found £1 billion to shore up the poll tax. They were the highest unemployment figures for 10 years. Both those stories got 2 sentences each on BBC radio bulletins at a time when you were broadcasting continuous news all day. And it seems to me if there's any serious consideration of even making the extended news bulletins permanent, that there needs to be some discipline, some self-discipline among the broadcasters to say, we're going to try and cover the whole range and not get obsessed with the flavour of today.
I absolutely agree with that. I mean, that is the objective. When you're in the Gulf War, I think you'll accept that that was a particular circumstance.
For a few days, yes.
But there's no doubt that we wish to cover in depth all the stories. We want to reflect all the range of opinions as authoritatively as we can. That's why we put more money to get specialist correspondents. That's why we want to go into depth, and the rolling news may well be the answer to that. We've got to get the right framework. There's another fact I didn't mention. I have to be very careful about depriving people of their programmes. The Radio 4 audience is an audience that loves Radio 4, and we have not yet got our transmitters in place to actually get as good a coverage on FM as we've got on long wave. And that is an important consideration, in my mind, and a strategic consideration. We're spending about £5 million a year on FM transmitters. It's no use us producing the programmes if we're not satisfied that people can hear, and we're not causing immense resentment by depriving people of their favourite programme.
Can we broaden this out a bit? Patrick Bowman, I think you've got a question.
Yes, I'd like to turn the question to music. A couple of weeks back, Marmaduke Hussey, the chairman of the BBC, said in a newspaper interview that he saw the BBC as the guardian of the cultural heritage. That's fine. That's exactly what one would expect of public service broadcasting in this country and what it's always been. He also added a little boast, a proud one at the end, that the BBC was the largest employer in the world of musicians and composers. How does that sit with the recent announcement that the BBC is contemplating axing its 5 orchestras?
Well, we haven't announced that we're contemplating it. We have a series of groups looking at the future of the BBC, in which they're looking at all sorts of themes, like the BBC as an entertainer, as an information provider, as an employer, as a cultural provider. The cultural group that have looked at it have produced their report. That hasn't been discussed yet by the Board of Management or the Board of Governors, but a leak of it went into the independent newspaper. We haven't considered that proposition at all. I don't contemplate the axing of orchestras. I see the role of the BBC as a cultural patron as one of its most important and prime characteristics, and one that should be sustained. The only question to be addressed is whether the funding arrangements should be identical for all our orchestras. If you take the Welsh Orchestra, for example, that is jointly funded between the licence payers and the Welsh Arts Council. If you take the orchestra in Northern Ireland, which used to be a BBC orchestra, it is no longer a BBC orchestra. It's called the Ulster Orchestra. It's funded by commercial money, and the BBC pays a contribution for its running. The BBC Symphony Orchestra has a different role. It is concerned with the commissioning of new music and the playing of contemporary music, and I see that as a very important part of its role and something quite unique in musical provision in this country. So the debate about the orchestra is nowhere near over, and we're talking about how we get classical music provision and that commissioning role sustained in the environment we'll be facing later on. So I hope that gives you some reassurance.
Well, there I'm afraid we must bring our radio discussion to an end. One thing we haven't got time for today at all is to go into complaints about specific programmes. But the number of complaints received is one way of measuring the way you feel about BBC output. Without any claims for scientific accuracy, here's the Bite Back hit list for 1991.
At number 10 is the old chestnut of anti-Tory bias, raised back in October by Tory party chairman Chris Patten.
If you don't like the 6 o'clock or 9 o'clock news, phone up. If you don't like Panorama, phone up. If you don't like the Today programme, I can't imagine that would ever happen.
A Sunday Times Maury poll later found that the majority of people think the BBC unbiased, and those who do detect any bias think it is in favour of the Tories. At number 9, there were complaints throughout the year about the raunchy lyrics on Top of the Pops.
But people are still having sex and nothing seems to stop them.
Presumably more of a problem for parents than for the children who buy the records and get them into the charts in the first place. The number of calls about BBC Two's Saturday Night Out, an evening of programmes for or about homosexuals in November, sent it straight to number 8. But nearly half the calls received were complimentary about this bold piece of programming.
What do lesbians actually do?
In fact, many more people were upset by the departure of presenter Anne Gregg from Holiday 91, enough to take her straight in at number 7. Still there at number 6, the perennial problem of bad language. Singled out for criticism this year was the charity extravaganza Comic Relief.
I never said I could act, did I?
At number 5, another regular irritant, what many viewers regard as the excessive amount of sport on television.
Oh, come on!
Particularly simultaneous showing of sport on both BBC channels at once. At numbers 4 and 3 is the Gulf War, which drew complaints about saturation coverage and the rescheduling of favourite programmes. Many viewers objected to a perceived pro-Iraqi bias, particularly in the coverage of the Allied bombing of the Baghdad bunker. The second biggest cause for complaints against the BBC is scheduling alterations as a whole. Many people are upset when the BBC promises to broadcast a certain programme at a certain time and then doesn't. But beating everything else and in at number 1 with a bullet, the most complained about programme of the year was the one that was never even shown. A vigorous campaign led by religious groups succeeded in persuading the BBC not to show the controversial film The Last Temptation of Christ.
I suppose it is rather ironic that the most complaints were received about a programme that was never shown. Of course, the BBC was then criticised for giving in to the complainers. That's the way it is. If you've complained to the BBC, have you ever wondered what happens to your phone call or your letter? How much notice does the BBC take of the complaints it receives? And how accountable is it to its viewers and listeners? Well, Bite Back reporter Carol Stone has been to find out.
500,000 of us phone the BBC every year.
Hello, Information Office.
The calls are answered either here in Television Centre or if it's radio in a similar room in Broadcasting House.
OK. Thank you very much for your call. I'll make sure that's logged.
The calls are typed up into the Information Office log and that gets circulated throughout the BBC for producers and managers to read. What happens if you write to the BBC? If you send your letter to a particular programme, you'll get a response probably directly from them. But if you write to the chairman or the Director General, the life of a letter can get a little more complicated. Here's the Director General's office. Let's find out what's in his postbag today. Hello, Kathy.
Hello.
Can we see what's in your post this morning?
Right.
Now, is this an average? Is it a lot?
No, this looks pretty normal.
Thames Television? No, Thames Polytechnic. Now that looks, yes, I see. That looks trouble to me. The official letters now leave Broadcasting House to go several miles across London to the new BBC building at White City.
Oxford Circus, Central Line, Lewis, right down to White City.
The mail that the Chairman and the Director General are going to reply to get replies drafted here in the Secretariat. The rest go further down the corridor. This is viewer and listener correspondence. They deal with around 2,500 letters a week. That's the bulk of the correspondence addressed to the BBC centrally. That's not all complaints, of course. Most of it is people asking for information. The assistants specialise in different programme areas, so you ought to get a well-informed answer. On the other hand, how many get a standard reply?
Not as many as you might think. I can't actually give you a figure because it's for every one of my staff to make their own assessment of how they're going to reply. If a lot of people write about some quite specific point, and if there is one answer to that, then to produce a standard letter which you send to all the people who are making the identical point doesn't seem to me to be awful. It seems to be entirely sensible, consistent, economical, and a very proper way to respond.
Even so, campaigners with a particular point of view may not be satisfied. Take the case of the Reptile Protection Trust. They'd been upset by Michael Palin going around the world in 80 days, being involved in the disemboweling of a live snake in a Canton restaurant. Their initial complaints, they felt, didn't get them very far, so they made other moves. First, they organised a write-in from a group of celebrities and 23 MPs. The majority received the standard reply. Then the Trust got an early day motion tabled in the House of Commons, and they featured in Points of View, but they still didn't get the programme re-edited before it was repeated last summer. So the Trust went to the Broadcasting Complaints Commission, which considers cases of unfair treatment. The Commission felt it didn't fall within their remit, so they referred it to the Broadcasting Standards Council, which deals with matters of taste and decency, and the complaint was partially upheld, though not on the grounds the Trust wanted. After all that, how do they feel now about the BBC's producers and managers?
They are sealed behind the typewriters and numerous other bureaucratic systems, and you really can't get access to them. They need to be exposed in the sense that they can be questioned directly about their involvement in these matters. It's all too easy at the moment for them to simply shirk it off. And when you bear in mind that we had something like 4 people working quite a great deal of time on this particular issue with a great deal of tenacity, it makes you wonder what chance the average person in the street has got making a complaint about something they feel strongly. We put in a lot of effort and we got virtually nowhere.
Although he rarely gets involved in these issues personally, it's the chairman of the BBC who is responsible for the corporation's accountability to the public. What effect do you think these complaints or these comments have on the programmes eventually?
Well, of course, it does depend very much on the validity of the comment. I mean, you very quickly learn, if you see as many letters as I do, when there's a lobby at work. But equally, I think it's a very important part of our public accountability, as indeed this programme is.
You say you have to be careful if there's a lobby at work, but surely with The Last Temptation of Christ there was a lobby at work and you did intervene.
That decision was actually taken by the managing director of television, although I certainly don't know the amount of letters I'd received. Mind you, I think he'd received a great deal himself. Yes, when I say you have to take into account that, I mean, not all lobbies are causes which necessarily, I think, it's in the interest of the BBC to agree with. I mean, they obviously have a right to give views to their expression of their feelings, but you mustn't automatically be influenced by a lobby. You must be influenced by whether a complaint is justified or not justified. That's the acid test.
Legally, the Board of Governors, which Marmaduke Hussey chairs, is the BBC. The governors are ultimately responsible for programme standards and represent the public interest.
Matters arising, there are only 2 matters arising. One, World Service Television. John, where is he? John, would you like to bring us up to date?
Yes, Chairman. I think it looks remarkably good. The news bulletins look very solid. We're all aware...
They meet on a regular basis with the Director General, whom they appoint, and the other members of the Board of Management, who run the corporation day to day. There are 12 governors, chosen from the traditional lists of the great and the good, to represent the national regions and particular areas of public life, like industry and trade unions. They are appointed by the government of the day, but is that necessarily the best system, or should their selection be more open?
Well, this is obviously a matter for consideration, and we're considering in the run-up to the new charter all sorts of varying issues, and that's one of them. I don't think the electoral system is very good. I mean, after all, the BBC is a very, very large and very, very important part of the whole body politic of this country. 94% of people listen or watch the BBC every week. And it's a huge business. And to run a business like that, you have to have people with considerable experience. You just don't want, good there would be, to have a whole range of people elected I mean, rather like electing a group of passengers to run British Airways. I mean, it isn't really a very appropriate system.
There's been an internal report by the BBC where there's a feeling that maybe the influence of the governors is too great and that maybe it should be reduced and there should be fewer and there should be trustees to run it. How do you react to that? Do you think you have been too hands-on in the last few years?
No, I don't think so. I think that the way we run the BBC, we've made a great many changes. One of the changes I made was to make certain that at all the governors' meetings, the majority of the Board of Management were present. We never have less than 7 out of 11, it's quite a lot. So all the discussions that take place about major issues are with the governors and the top management together. That's the way you get a consensus view, and a view that can stretch right across the whole organisation as a result. Of course, it is a function in the end for the governors to take the most difficult and the most serious strategic decisions. And that is what we do. But it's one decision a year, 2 decisions a year, not more than that, if there's many.
Well, since you've been chairman, you've made some significant decisions as far as the Director General is concerned.
Yeah.
You've sacked one Director General. The present Director General is leaving before he would want to. Do you feel that that's a position that he should be allowed to be put into, a very difficult position for him?
I'm not going to discuss personalities. The first Director General did actually resign. We renewed the present Director General's contract for a further year, so he has a spell of 6 years. We then decided to pass the baton, if you like, on to his deputy, who'd been his deputy. They're both very able men. One has done an extremely good job, I'm sure the next will as well. There has to be some method of appointing whom is the best person to look after the BBC over a period of years.
Well, so Michael, on this question of accountability, I believe that a task force within the BBC has suggested that the Board of Governors has become too involved in everyday management decisions rather than representing the public interest, which is really its job. Now, you've been working with them for 6 years. What do you think?
Yes, it isn't my experience. I'm the closest, I suppose, to the Board of Governors than anybody in the BBC. I think the Chairman was right in saying that we now do involve the Board of Management in the Board of Governors discussions in ways which we didn't 5 years ago. And I think that has enabled the BBC to play to its strengths across radio and television in ways that it didn't. So I don't actually believe that there's been intervention in the day-to-day management. The classic definition, I think, if I could just say that the role of the Chairman, the role of the Director General, was at Michael Swan's, I think, which was that the Chairman should read the map and the Director General should drive the car. I think actually what has happened is that I've driven the car and we've jointly read the map because the strategy has emerged from discussions between Board of Management and Board of Governors.
Yeah, but surely there is a conflict of interest if the Board of Governors is involved in making decisions which it then has to represent the public interest on.
Well, they are there to make sure the public interest is maintained and that I'm sensitive to it. Now, we are all members of a public service broadcasting organisation. We joined it because the BBC was that kind of organisation.
And you're totally happy about the way the Board of Governors works then?
Over the last 5 years, I have not found it a difficulty which some of my predecessors have had.
But how did you feel about the fact that your appointment was not extended for a further 5 years? It was widely reported that you wanted and expected it to be.
I certainly didn't expect another 5 years, and I think I'm sometimes misrepresented there. It was questioned what was the most appropriate time for me to go. Somebody had to lead the BBC through the Charter and beyond the Charter, and therefore there had to be a sensible period of transition, and certainly wouldn't have been appropriate for me to have gone on. So I retire in 1996 in any case, before the Charter, at the age of 60.
But you're suggesting you would have liked longer?
Certainly. I made it quite clear that I thought the most appropriate time for me to go was probably in 1994, after the next financial inquiry had taken place into the BBC, than in 1993.
Of course, you have presided over the BBC for the first time, I think, in its history, over a period of contraction rather than expansion. Don't you feel rather badly about that?
It was inevitable. We had always expanded, our income had grown, that wasn't going to be the future. We had to move from a position where we had always been a monopoly, we always felt we had to do everything ourselves, and the world had changed outside us. Independent producers were going up, new facility houses were developing. We're sitting now in an independent studio. These were developing. The BBC had to be prepared to say, right, we will now use these resources, we won't do everything ourselves, and that meant inevitably the size of the BBC would be would be contracted.
You may not worry about it, but some people do. Jocelyn Hay, the voice of the listener and viewer.
Yes, indeed, I do, and I'm very glad you've mentioned policy, because this is of concern. The BBC's role has been central to the quality of British broadcasting, and I think in the future scenario it's probably going to be even more important. Now, it comes off the renewal of its charter in 1996. The Home Secretary has called for a public debate before any far-reaching decisions are made. I would like to know what your vision of the future shape and size of the BBC is at that time, in 5 years' time, because it seems from the outside that many decisions, many priorities are being redefined within the BBC, and decisions are being made now which will preempt much of that debate in future. And they are being made very often, it seems from the outside, for short-term financial reasons rather than from long-term reasons of providing a strong central core of British broadcasting.
Can we answer that? Are irrevocable decisions being made now?
No, what we've done is set up these 15 groups to actually ask the difficult questions. What should the BBC be doing for the future that it's not doing at present? We've talked about a 24-hour rolling news. What should it not be doing that we are doing at present? And we've talked a bit about popular music and all these kind of issues. Now, the process that we've gone through is set up these groups, and it's been a process of groups of men and women across radio, across television, across the World Service, looking at these issues. We will be, over the next 6 months, considering these as the boards, and then we'll issue, after the election now, a statement of how we see the BBC's future as public service provider.
A lot of these decisions are being made on the assumption that there is going to be less money available. Now, Professor Ehrenberg.
Now, I'm very worried that finding radically more money for the BBC is not on your agenda, on the BBC's agenda. If you ask viewers, which is your market, then if they have the option of watching ITV and Channel 4 free without paying the license fee, they say not on your Nelly. 99% of them say we want to pay for BBC One rather than give it up. My question, Michael, is do you think that viewers, your market, want you to raise more money from them to make better programs, a wider range of better programs, or at least programs as good as they used to have? Or do you want to have do they want to have cuts?
I think that whatever we've done in terms of cuts have not damaged the range and variety of our programming. I'm absolutely sure the changes we've made of cutting resources, getting out of buildings, reducing our internal provision and relying more on the outside market have not affected the amount of money put into programs. In fact, it's enabled to put more into programs. Now, whether the public would be prepared to pay a higher licence fee than a consumer index, it will be part of the debate.
Let's just try, shall we? How many people... Will you just a second, sir?
The BBC is paid for by people across the whole of the country. There are as many people living in the North region as live inside the M25. Yet if we look at arts coverage in particular, you'd think it was LWT. Now, what are you going to do to make arts coverage cover the whole of the regions so that England is not a blank space, so that the Burnley National Blues Festival, which is First Division, is not ignored, while its football team, which is Fourth Division going on Third, is covered?
I think that's a genuine criticism that I take very seriously. I happen to come from Birmingham. I'm slightly disappointed that the Late Show, which was a major investment in arts programming, has actually concentrated too much in the southeast of England. I want its remit to be wider. I want the BBC to be representing the regions, the regional arts festivals, the music festivals, more than we have in the past. We've made that very clear to all our staff that we want to do it. The BBC is a British Broadcasting Corporation. Too much money, I believe, is spent in the southeast. And we need to spend more money outside.
Can I take a point from the lady in black up there?
I was involved in the Reptile Protection Trust complaint. If there are a number of letters, and there were over 100, all asking 3 specific points, and those 3 specific points you'd assume would be able to be handled in 3 specific answers, but to those specific points, they weren't. So it was like a standard evasion rather than a standard letter.
A standard evasion.
Well, I'm sorry about that. I mean, I've tried very hard to open the BBC up and make it more accountable. The fact that I'm sitting here, I assure you, nobody else who runs a broadcasting organisation in the world is prepared to do this. They come and look at it and they say, that's a good idea, and they don't do it. So I do believe in an open and accountable broadcasting organisations. We take complaints seriously. We have the listeners and viewers correspondence section, and I'm sorry if you didn't feel we adequately handled it.
Well, I'm afraid that really is all that we have time for tonight. Our thanks to Sir Michael Checkland for occupying the hot seat. Thanks too to our studio audience, who actually do come from all parts of the country and not just from the southeast. I hope you feel that some of your questions have been answered. Bite Back will be with you next Sunday afternoon in its regular monthly slot. We'll be looking at the BBC and advertising, our commercials sneaking in through the back door, and a film report shows how the sound on natural history programmes is anything but natural. If you want to take part in Bite Back, our phone number and address follow shortly. But for now, goodbye. You can write to us at Bite Back, PO Box 2085, London W12 8XR. And please include your phone number. Or you can call us on the hotline on 081 749 9779.